The fluorescent lights buzzed above Sacred Heart ER like insects trapped in glass. Natalie Hayes pushed through the sliding doors at 11:03 p.m., winter air still clinging to her shoulders, and the familiar smell of antiseptic and burnt coffee wrapped around her like a uniform she'd never taken off. 12 years since she'd worn the real one. 12 years of being invisible. She clocked in without speaking to anyone. The night shift had a rhythm, quiet enough that you could hear the ventilators breathing in the trauma bays, chaotic enough that no one asked questions about the nurse who moved through the corridors like someone who'd learned to occupy space without disturbing it. Her name badge read N. Hayes, RN in plain white letters. Nothing else. No credentials, no history, no proof of the decade she'd spent holding together men whose bodies were trying to separate from their souls. The unit patch was still there, sewn into the lining of her jacket, tucked against her ribs. She'd touched it twice already, once in the car, once in the locker room. A habit. A reminder. The patch was faded now, the green worn nearly grey, stitched with thread that had outlasted the unit it represented. She'd kept it when she walked away. Kept it when she changed her name, moved to Denver, took work at a hospital where no one knew what she'd done or why she'd stopped. Natalie moved to the nurse's station and began reviewing the evening's charts. Her hands were steady as she logged into the system, fingers moving with the kind of precision that came from muscle memory, not the muscle memory of typing, but of working under pressure, in darkness, with stakes that made normal fear seem quaint. The scar running along her left forearm caught the fluorescent light when she reached for the chart rack. 3 inches long. Shrapnel from Sanjin Valley. She'd closed the wound herself with 4.0 sutures and moved on to the next casualty. The ER was predictable tonight. A diabetic in Bay 2 with a blood sugar reading of 487. An elderly man in Bay 4 complaining of chest pain, probably nothing, probably anxiety, probably going home in 4 hours with a reassurance and a prescription for antacids. A teenager in the waiting room with what looked like a dislocated shoulder, sitting rigid, refusing to move. Normal. Manageable. The kind of night where you could fade into the background and let medicine do its quiet work. Then Dr. Marcus Hargrove arrived. He came through the physician's entrance at 11:27 p.m., his designer shoes clicking against the tile in a rhythm that announced his presence before his face appeared. Everything about him spoke the language of privilege, the $14,000 Rolex on his left wrist, the tailored coat that probably cost more than Natalie's monthly rent, the confidence of a man who'd never been told no by anyone who mattered. He was 48, with the kind of grooming that required a personal assistant and a dermatologist on speed dial. His cologne arrived 3 seconds before his body did, a scent like money distilled into liquid form. Natalie didn't look up. She'd learned that lesson years ago: make eye contact with certain men and they always wanted something. They wanted to know why you were so quiet, why you never laughed at their jokes, why you moved through a room like you were counting exits. It was safer to stay absorbed in the charts, to let her fingers continue their work across the keyboard while the outside world took care of itself. But Hargrove's eyes stopped on her anyway. He paused at the nurse's station, reviewing the shift roster with the kind of calculation that went beyond professional interest. His gaze moved across her face like he was scanning a database, searching for something, and then down to her hands as she worked. Natalie could feel the weight of his attention the way animals feel a predator entering the territory, not fear exactly, but awareness. Alertness. The knowing that something had shifted, even if only slightly. "Who's the night charge?" he asked Dr. Patricia Chen, the other attending physician working his rotation. "Hayes," Patricia said without looking up from her own patient. "She's been here for 3 months. Solid work. Hasn't missed a single shift." Hargrove nodded slowly, still watching. Natalie could see him in her peripheral vision, calculating something behind his eyes. He turned away finally, moving toward the physician's office, but not before she caught the moment his expression changed, the instant his face registered that she wasn't ordinary, that something in her composure, in the way she moved through her work, had triggered something in his pattern recognition. She didn't flinch. She never did. Over the next 4 hours, Natalie made her rounds with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything. She checked on the diabetic in Bay 2, confirming the insulin drip was running at the correct rate, 6 units per hour, precise and unforgiving. She moved to the elderly gentleman in Bay 4 and actually listened to his story, really listened, the way most nurses had forgotten how to do, and heard the tremor in his voice that suggested his chest pain might actually mean something. She called for an EKG. She stayed until the first set of troponin results came back negative, knowing they would, knowing she'd still done the right thing by not dismissing his fear. The teenager's dislocated shoulder required her to assist with the reduction. Hargrove performed the procedure himself, and Natalie worked the opposite side, preparing the local anesthetic and the 2 milligrams midazolam for sedation, her movements so practiced they looked like dance. She didn't announce what she was doing. She simply anticipated what was needed and had it ready, the kind of intuition that came from thousands of hours of working in emergency medicine, from understanding crisis the way most people understood breathing. "Get the patient comfortable on the stretcher," Hargrove instructed, his tone clipped, professional. Natalie was already moving before he'd finished the sentence, positioning the teenager's arm, adjusting the pillow, her hand steady and sure. The boy's eyes tracked her movement, following her face, something in his expression suggesting he trusted her more than the doctor giving orders. She didn't speak to him, just met his eyes for a moment, long enough to convey that she'd done this before, that she knew what to expect, that he was going to be fine. Then she turned back to the supplies and began preparing the injection site. The sedation took hold. The reduction took 90 seconds. The shoulder relocated with an audible pop, and Natalie had a sling waiting, already adjusted to the correct size and angle, the moment Hargrove stepped back. Professional. Efficient. Invisible. What Hargrove didn't see was the way her hands never trembled when the pressure was high, the way she processed triage faster than nurses with 20 years' experience, the way she moved through the ER like someone who'd learned to function in chaos so complete it had become normal. He didn't see the patch sewn into her jacket lining, the one with the insignia of Naval Special Warfare Development Group, the unit that didn't officially exist, that trained in places the government wouldn't acknowledge, that sent people into situations civilians weren't supposed to imagine. He didn't see any of that. He just saw paperwork. Around 2 a.m., during a rare quiet moment, Natalie sat at the nurse's station and began her charting. Her documentation was meticulous, the kind of precision that came from knowing that in the military, your notes might be examined by lawyers, by courts-martial, by people deciding whether you'd followed protocol or broken it. Every timestamp accurate to the minute. Every vital sign recorded exactly. Every medication dose verified and double-checked. Every patient interaction documented in language so clear it was almost clinical. She was logging the teenager's post-reduction vitals when Hargrove walked past with a patient file in his hands. He slowed. His eyes moved down to her screen, reading her charting for the shoulder reduction. She could feel him processing the information, the precision, the accuracy, the detail that went beyond standard documentation. Most nurses wrote patient sedated, reduction performed, sling applied. Patient tolerated procedure well. Natalie wrote timestamps, drug names, dosages, patient responses, post-procedure assessments, reassessment intervals. Hargrove didn't comment. He just kept walking, but something in his posture had changed. Something in the way his shoulders moved suggested he'd filed away information, added a note to some internal database, registered that this particular quiet nurse might be worth paying attention to. The last code of the night came at 3:13 a.m., a 52-year-old woman brought in by ambulance with crushing chest pain and no blood pressure. Cardiogenic shock. Possible cardiac tamponade. The ER erupted into controlled chaos, doctors shouting orders, nurses running supplies, alarms screaming on the monitor as her heart tried and failed to maintain rhythm. Natalie moved to the bedside and began preparing for a pericardiocentesis, the needle aspiration of fluid from around the heart that might be crushing it. Her hands found the supplies without looking, muscle memory and training combining into something that looked like magic to everyone watching. The 18-gauge needle. The echo probe. The approach through the left anterior chest wall. She had everything ready before Dr. Chen finished explaining to the patient what he was about to do. The needle advanced. The fluid came back dark, blood. Too much blood. Cardiac tamponade. Aspiration, Natalie said quietly, and the needle moved, drawing out the fluid that had been compressing the heart. The woman's blood pressure climbed. The monitor rhythm shifted from the chaotic dysrhythmia to something approximating normal. The woman gasped, and her eyes opened. She was alive because Natalie's hands knew exactly what to do. Hargrove watched from across the room, and Natalie saw the moment his face registered something it hadn't before, not admiration exactly, but recognition. The recognition that she wasn't ordinary. That she'd done something too perfect, too practiced, too sure to be the result of 3 months of night shift nursing. But before he could process that thought further, the woman on the stretcher opened her eyes fully and grabbed Natalie's hand. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you." Natalie squeezed back once, then released. "You're going to be fine," she said, and turned away to prepare the room for the cardiologist. The night carried on. Hargrove disappeared into the physician's office, and Natalie returned to her charts, her documentation, her careful invisible work. But something had shifted in the balance of the room. Something had registered. The quiet nurse had revealed a competence that didn't match her 3-month tenure, and Hargrove's attention, once focused, didn't easily scatter. Around 5 a.m., as the night was beginning to crack into something that might be dawn, Natalie sat alone in the break room with a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. She pulled her jacket closer and touched the patch sewn into the lining, that faded green insignia, the reminder of who she used to be. The memory came anyway, unbidden, the way it always did when she was tired enough and the walls were down. Helmand Province. Sanjan Valley. A convoy moving through terrain that wanted to kill them. An IED detonating under the lead Humvee, explosion blooming orange in the darkness, and she was running toward the fire because that was the only direction that mattered. She reached the vehicle and found Petty Officer First Class Marcus Chen underneath the twisted metal, his legs gone from the knees down, his blood spreading across the sand in a pattern that looked almost like a map of places she'd never see again. She knelt beside him and took his hand, and his eyes found hers and he said, "Don't let me go," and she said, "I've got you," and she held his hand while his body shut down and his eyes went empty and she became the last thing he ever felt. That was 12 years ago. That was in another life, in a uniform she didn't wear anymore, in a role she'd walked away from because watching people die had become a job she couldn't do anymore. She touched the patch again and took a breath. In 6 hours, the day shift would arrive. In 6 hours, Dr. Hargrove would begin whatever had occurred to him when he watched her hands work during the pericardiocentesis. In 6 hours, everything would change, but not yet. Not now. Now she was still invisible. Now she was still just a nurse keeping her eyes down and her hand steady and her secret sewn into the lining of her jacket where no one would ever think to look. The coffee was cold. She drank it anyway. The coffee was cold. She drank it anyway. The cafeteria hummed with the white noise of 100 conversations, the clink of trays, the hiss of the espresso machine, the low murmur of doctors and nurses carving out 15 minutes between shifts. Natalie sat alone at a corner table, her scrub still damp from the night shift, watching steam rise from a cup she'd filled 6 hours ago. The taste didn't matter. Nothing tasted like anything anymore. She was reaching for her sandwich when his voice cut through the ambient chatter like a scalpel. $20 says the mouse in 3B quits within a week. Dr. Marcus Hargrove stood 3 tables away, his white coat immaculate, his posture the casual arrogance of a man who'd never questioned his right to take up space. 2 residents flanked him, medical students still young enough to think confidence was something you learned in textbooks. Natalie didn't look up. She knew the cadence of mockery, she'd heard it in Kandahar, in the voices of men who measured respect by how loud they could be. "You really think she'll break that fast?" One of the residents glanced toward the food line where Natalie stood gathering her lunch. "She's been here 3 months. Never says a word. Keeps her head down." Hargrove's voice carried the easy contempt of someone performing for an audience. "That's always the tell. The quiet ones are fragile. Push them a little, they shatter. I give her 7 days, maximum. Anyone want to take that bet?" 3 other tables had gone quiet. Natalie could feel the weight of their attention like a targeting laser. She continued forward, her tray steady in her hands, tomato soup in a ceramic bowl, a turkey sandwich on wheat, a bottle of water she wouldn't drink. The movements were measured, economical. Hands that had once sutured arteries in the dark while artillery shook the walls around her knew how to carry a lunch tray without trembling. She passed within 3 feet of Hargrove's table. He stood. The motion was smooth, almost casual, as though his body had simply decided to rise without conscious intention. His chair scraped backward. Natalie felt the micro-shift in air pressure before she saw his arm extend, watched the calculation happen in the quarter-second before impact. He didn't look at her. He was still talking to the resident when his elbow connected with her tray. Physics took over. The bowl arced. The sandwich tumbled. The water bottle hit the tile floor with a splash that sounded like applause. Soup spread in a red island across the linoleum, the smell of tomato and salt rising in a small cloud. The cafeteria's ambient noise contracted. 20 faces turned. 20 pairs of eyes watched to see what the mouse would do. Natalie stood motionless for exactly 1 second, holding the empty tray. Oh. Hargrove turned, and his expression was a masterpiece of concern that didn't reach his eyes. Clumsy me. I didn't see you there. A pause. A smile that showed his teeth but not warmth. Better clean that up, Hayes. Unless you're too delicate for messes? I'd hate for you to strain yourself. His voice carried across the cafeteria like a broadcast. 2 nurses at the far table stopped eating. A medical student pulled out his phone, and Natalie caught the motion, the instinct to document, to share, the universal human impulse to record the moment someone else fell apart. Except she didn't fall apart. She set the tray on the nearest table. She gathered napkins from the dispenser, 7, 8, 9, and knelt on the tile floor, her knees making contact with the damp mess without hesitation. The soup had cooled already. Tomato seeds clung to the paper. She worked methodically, pressing the napkins into the spreading liquid, absorbing it all, wiping the floor in small precise circles as if it required the focus of a surgical field. That's right, Hargrove said, his voice pleasant. See how easy that is? Natalie didn't respond. She never did. The next evening, she was standing at the nursing station during shift change, inputting discharge notes for 3 patients who'd been admitted in the early hours of morning, a woman with pneumonia, a man with diabetic shock, an elderly couple who'd come in with chest pain that turned out to be severe indigestion. The charting was meticulous. Every vital sign, every medication, every conversation documented with the precision of someone who understood that paperwork was a kind of proof. Proof that people had been here, that they'd mattered, that their care had been witnessed and recorded. The stack of patient charts sat in a designated slot, organized by room number, color-coded by acuity, each one a small monument to attention. Hargrove approached the nursing station like a man walking into his own living room. He moved between the nurses with the assumption of a central sun, that the world would organize itself around his gravity. 4 nurses were present. 2 medical technicians. A nursing student observing her 3rd shift. Everyone pretended not to notice him. He pulled a chart from the middle of her stack. Hayes. Not a greeting. A command. When I request a chart, I expect it organized properly. Not this sloppy excuse for documentation. Natalie looked up from her computer. That chart is organized by protocol, doctor. Room number, acuity color. I don't want your excuses. He dropped the chart. Not placed it. Dropped it, and the paper scattered like he'd exploded a small bomb, pages sliding across the desk, some fluttering to the floor. The sound was sharp, the slap of paper on formica, the whisper of documents settling. The entire nursing station went crystalline. 4 nurses stopped typing. 1 tech stopped moving. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to hold their breath, the usual electronic hum dropping into a register so low you could almost hear the silence underneath. Natalie's jaw tightened. It was the smallest tell, the muscle working once, twice, then stillness. She stood without a word and began gathering the scattered pages. 1, 2, 3. Each page picked up with the care you'd use for something fragile. Her hands moved with the economy of someone who'd done emergency triage in the dark, who understood that speed without precision was just chaos with motion. One tear escaped. Just one. It wasn't the release of crying, there was no shaking, no sound, no performance of emotion. It was the body's involuntary response to pressure, the way a cut bleeds, the way pupils dilate in darkness. She wiped it away with the back of her hand while gathering the last page, never breaking eye contact with Hargrove. The room held its breath. When she spoke, her voice came from somewhere deep. Not loud. The opposite of loud. It was the kind of quiet that made people listen harder, that made the air in the room feel thinner, more difficult to breathe. I've held together men with worse injuries than your ego, Doctor. The words were stones dropped into still water. She organized the scattered pages with deliberate precision, grouping them by section, tapping the stack against the desk to align them, placing it back in the color-coded slot exactly where it belonged. The efficiency of her movements was surgical. The message was clear: this will not break me. Hargrove stared at her, and for the first time, something flickered behind his eyes. Not anger. Frustration. The micro-expression of a man who'd expected a different response, who'd engineered this moment for tears or submission or resignation, and instead gotten stone. File that properly, he said, but his voice had lost its edge. He turned and walked away, his white coat trailing behind him like he was trying to sweep the moment under it. The nursing station released its breath. Nobody moved for 30 seconds. Then one of the nurses, Rodriguez, who'd worked at Sacred Heart for 9 years, quietly said, "Coffee." Another nurse nodded. The spell broke. People returned to their charting, their documentation, their small acts of care. But their eyes found Natalie, just for a moment, and something shifted in that look. Recognition, maybe. Or the beginning of understanding that the mouse had fangs. Later, alone in the locker room, Natalie sat on the bench in front of her assigned space and removed her jacket. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song. The room smelled of antiseptic and sweat and the phantom residue of 100 shift changes. She ran her fingers along the inside of the jacket lining, feeling the weight of the faded Special Forces unit patch sewn carefully into the fabric, the only physical proof that she'd been someone else, somewhere else, someone who'd been called something other than Mouse. She whispered to the empty lockers, "Just keep your head down." But her hands were shaking now, and she understood with the clarity of someone who'd survived what she'd survived that keeping her head down had become infinitely harder. Hargrove had marked her. He'd tested her. And whatever happened next would be different from the quiet erasure she'd been trying to build. At 9 p.m., the ER doors hissed open and a man was wheeled in on a gurney, his face pale with the particular shade that meant acute pain, the kind that didn't care about apology or explanation, the kind that just demanded relief. The paramedic report came through rapid fire: acute abdominal pain, rigidity in the right lower quadrant, temp elevated at 39.2 degrees Celsius. Appendix. About to rupture. Hargrove took the case himself, which meant Natalie would be assisting in the OR, which meant she'd be standing across from him under the unforgiving lights of the surgical theater, hands working in practiced patterns while he watched. But that wasn't the worst part. David Chen arrived at Sacred Heart ER at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday, doubled over in pain, his face the color of old concrete. Army Ranger. 23 years of service. Appendicitis with rupture risk, the kind that kills fast if you hesitate. The triage nurse called it in immediately: acute abdomen, peritoneal signs, white count elevated to 18,700. Surgery needed in the next 2 hours or sepsis would begin its quiet work. Dr. Hargrove materialized in the ER before the labs came back. He read the chart standing over David's stretcher, his eyes tracking the vital signs like a predator measuring weakness. BP 142/88. Heart rate 104. Temperature 101.4. Hargrove's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture, a decision made. He'd handled this case personally. as lead surgeon. Which meant Natalie would be assisting. Which meant he could watch her work. Watch her decisions. Document her every move. Build his case. The OR doors hissed open at 9:24 p.m. Natalie was already there, prepping the surgical station with the methodical precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times. Instrument trays arranged in perfect order. Sutures counted. Equipment checked twice. Hargrove watched her from the doorway, arms crossed, his white coat perfectly pressed like he'd never actually operated on anyone in his life. "Evening, Senior Chief," he said, using her military rank deliberately, a small dig, a reminder that she didn't fit here, that he knew something was off about her. That he was watching. Natalie didn't look up from the Mayo stand. "Doctor. Patient's ready for anesthesia." The surgery began at 10:13 p.m. Hargrove made the incision himself, a clean vertical line through skin and fascia, controlled and precise, the work of someone who had performed this procedure hundreds of times. The peritoneal cavity opened. The smell of infection drifted up, sour, metallic, the signature scent of an appendix in advanced stages of perforation. One more day and David Chen would have been dead. Septic shock. Multi-organ failure. A closed casket funeral and a folded flag. Natalie moved into position across the table, her hands already anticipating Hargrove's next move. Retractor. Suction. Bovicautery for hemostasis. Her movements weren't hesitant or deferential. They were fluid. Economical. The movements of someone who had done emergency trauma work in field conditions where hesitation meant someone didn't make it home. Hargrove isolated the appendiceal artery and began ligating vessels. Blood loss controlled. The inflamed appendix came free at 10:34 p.m. Natalie had the specimen basin ready before he even looked for it. She was watching his hands, predicting his needs, her own hands moving like they were choreographed to his, a dance performed only by people who understood each other at a cellular level. What happened next was the thing Hargrove didn't expect. What made him freeze for a half-second and stare at her hands like they were moving on their own? The peritoneal cavity needed closure. Standard procedure. Running stitch, for 0.0 chromic gut, simple interrupted sutures spaced exactly 6 mm apart. Every surgical student learned this. Every competent surgeon could do it in her sleep. But Natalie's sutures weren't just competent. They weren't just precise. They were the sutures of someone who had closed abdominal cavities in a convoy under fire, where the bleeding didn't stop because of perfect technique but because your hands knew exactly where infection would bloom and sealed it off preemptively. Her needle angle was military. Her tension control was field hospital. Her rhythm was combat. Hargrove watched her work for exactly 17 seconds without speaking. Then he continued with the fascial closure as if nothing unusual had happened. But something had. They both knew it. David Chen was semi-conscious through the sedation, that strange twilight where pain fades into something abstract and voices sound like they're coming from underwater. His eyes kept drifting to Natalie's hands. Watching them. Tracking the sutures. His lips moved at 10:51 p.m., just as she was finishing the peritoneal layer. "You're a combat medic," he whispered. His voice was slurred, barely audible above the ventilator hiss. "I've seen that suture pattern. Field hospitals. Sanjin Valley, 2010. The room went so quiet you could hear the monitor beeping. Natalie didn't pause. Didn't flinch. Didn't acknowledge that a man pumped full of fentanyl and versed had just recognized something about her that nobody at Sacred Heart was supposed to know. She finished the suture, tied off the knot, and moved to the next layer as if David Chen had said nothing at all. As if the past 7 years of invisibility hadn't just been shattered by a ranger who remembered the pattern of hands that had saved lives under fire. Hargrove's eyes narrowed. He filed it away. That detail. That recognition. He didn't understand what David meant, not yet, but he understood that Natalie's hands had communicated something to another military person that transcended surgical skill. That mattered. That was useful. The surgery concluded at 11:24 p.m. Appendix removed. Cavity clean. No complications. David Chen would wake up in recovery with post-operative pain and a scar, but he would live. That part was certain. What wasn't certain was whether Natalie's secret had just started dying on that operating table. Natalie was removing her gloves when Hargrove's phone rang. He stepped into the hallway, still in his surgical mask, his voice dropping into something that wasn't quite threatening but had all the ingredients of threat mixed into the tone. She heard fragments through the window in the OR door. Natalie Hayes. Yes, 3 months. Competent but concerning. I'd like your thoughts on her suitability for our department. He was calling the board members. The ones who owed him referral fees. The ones who'd sent him lucrative supply contracts in exchange for directing their imaging equipment and wound care products through his department. He was planting seeds. Raising concerns. Building a narrative about her judgment, her protocols, her potential liability to the hospital. The next call came at 11:13 p.m. Still in the hallway. Still in his mask. Still pretending this was routine. Colorado Springs Clinic? Yes, I'm trying to reach someone about a former employee. Natalie Hayes. Worked there approximately 4 years ago. I'm calling as a reference check. Were there any performance issues? Any disciplinary history? Anything regarding her stability or judgment? Natalie knew what this was. She'd been trained to recognize asymmetric warfare. This was the phase where the enemy gathered intelligence before the main assault. Hargrove was calling her references, the ones she'd deliberately kept vague, the ones from a clinic that no longer existed, the ones that had no real way to verify anything because the trail was designed to be untraceable. She'd listed Colorado Springs Clinic. She'd listed dates that corresponded to a period where she was still using her real name, still trying to be normal, still working in settings where nobody asked questions about why a surgical nurse with 7 years of operational medical experience was treating diabetic foot wounds in a strip mall clinic. She changed out of her scrubs at midnight and found herself in the parking lot before she remembered walking there. The Denver air was cold, 42 degrees, dry, the kind of cold that came down from the peaks and made everything feel sharp and dangerous. Her car was parked in the back corner where she always parked it, where she could see the exits. There was a white envelope taped to her steering wheel. Her hands were steady when she opened it. That was the training. That was what Helmand Province taught you. Your hands didn't betray you even when the rest of you wanted to collapse. The letter was typed. Professional. Institutional. Written warning, failure to adapt to departmental standards. Documentation exceeds protocol requirements. Supply tracking outside scope of nursing practice. Recommend immediate alignment with new documentation protocols effective immediately. Signature, Dr. Marcus Hargrove. Date, 11:33 p.m. tonight. While she was closing David Chen's abdomen. While she was saving his life. He was building the case to take hers. She sat in the driver's seat with the door open, the cold air pouring in, the letter in her lap. Her jacket was in the back seat. She could feel the weight of the patch through the fabric. The faded Special Forces unit patch. The thing she'd kept sewn into her lining for 7 years. The thing nobody could take away. The thing that meant nothing in a civilian hospital except liability. Except proof that she'd lied about her background. Except grounds for termination for falsifying employment history. The parking lot was empty except for a security camera mounted on the corner of the building. Always watching. Always recording. She touched the patch through the jacket fabric and thought about disappearing again. Moving to another city. Another hospital. Another identity. Another 7 years of keeping her head down while people like Hargrove decided who was worth saving and who could be discarded. But David Chen's voice kept echoing. That whisper through the sedation. You're a combat medic. I've seen that suture pattern in field hospitals. Someone had recognized her. Someone had seen her hands and known exactly what they'd been trained to do. That changed something. That made the invisibility less like protection and more like erasure. At 12:14 a.m., Natalie's phone rang. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. But something about the timing, the precision of it, made her pick up. Senior Chief Hayes. A man's voice. Calm. Military. The kind of calm that came from someone accustomed to making life-and-death decisions before breakfast. This is Commander Garrett Mitchell, Naval Special Warfare. We need to talk about what happened in that OR tonight. 2:03 a.m. The waiting room doors burst open and he fills the frame like a storm system arriving, 6'4", wild-eyed, jacket torn at the shoulder, right hand trembling around a .45 caliber handgun that caught the fluorescent light and threw it back cold and sharp. His voice came out raw, shredded, the sound of someone whose nerve endings were screaming a frequency only his body could hear. I need something for the pain. Give me something now. The waiting room fractured. A pregnant woman near the registration desk screamed, high-pitched, animal, and dove behind a plastic chair that would have stopped nothing. Two elderly men scrambled toward the back corridor, knocking over a side table. A mother grabbed her child and ran. The security guard at the far end of the hall made the calculation in 2 seconds and bolted through the double doors, radio already in his hand. The waiting room nurses vanished like smoke through the back entrance toward the pharmacy lockdown. Within 15 seconds, the space had emptied except for 3 patients too slow or too confused to process what was happening, all of them now crouched behind chairs and a reception desk that was made of laminate and prayer. The gunman fired once into the ceiling. Plaster rained down like snow. The sound was enormous, a concussive punch that registered in the chest first, then the ears, then in the primitive part of the brain that recognized this was real and could end everything in the next 5 seconds. A siren began wailing somewhere deeper in the hospital. Hargrove was at the nursing station. She could see him from the corner of her vision, his hand slamming the lockdown button, his body already moving toward the administrative corridor, his face doing that thing it always did when he encountered something unpredictable, calculating the angle of self-preservation before anyone else finished processing that the situation existed. Natalie walked directly toward the gunman. Her palms were open at her sides. Her face was utterly still, not the frozen face of terror but the composed architecture of someone who had seen worse and lived. She moved at a steady pace, her scrubs whispering against her thighs, and she kept her eyes on his hands first, reading the tremor in his fingers where they gripped the weapon. The pupils blown wide, the sweat beading on his temples despite the Arctic air conditioning, the way his jaw clenched and unclenched like he was grinding glass between his teeth. She recognized this not as rage but as withdrawal agony mixed with desperation, the specific mathematics of a body betraying itself, not meth-fueled violence but something closer to drowning. I see you, she said quietly, still moving forward. Her voice carried the weight of stone sinking through water, no panic, no negotiation, just absolute presence. I see the pain. He swung the gun toward her. His hand shook so badly the barrel traced a circle in the air. Let me help. She kept walking, one step, another step, her hands remaining open and visible. She was using the voice she had used on 18-year-old Marines who were losing limbs in the dark, steady, unhurried, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst and still choosing to move toward the suffering instead of away from it. The weapon isn't helping. It's making the pain worse. You don't know what his voice cracked. He was crying now, the gun wavering in his grip as his shoulders began to shake. His left hand came up to his face and then fell away, useless. 7 minutes, she would tell them later, though no one would believe it at first. 7 minutes to close 20 feet of terrified space. 7 minutes of her talking about pain being information, about how his body was screaming because the chemistry had changed, because the substances he'd used to quiet the ache had worn away and left him standing in a waiting room at 2 in the morning with nothing but a gun and desperation. She never looked away. She never flinched. She simply walked toward him the way a person walks toward a wounded animal, carefully, without threatening, with the absolute certainty that this could be saved if the right thing was said at the right moment. When she was close enough to smell the sweat and the stale alcohol on his breath, she reached out. Her hand moved with the terrifying fluid precision of muscle memory, the kind of precision that had once guided hands through open abdomens in field hospitals while mortars landed outside the tent. "Give it to me," she said. Not a question. A command. The tone of someone whose authority lived in her skeleton. His hand opened. The gun fell into hers. She set it carefully on a plastic chair beside him, as though she were setting down a sleeping infant. "Gurney," she called to a frozen tech who had apparently decided the back corner of the waiting room was adequate shelter. 1 mg lorazepam, for push. 25 mg of diphenhydramine for the withdrawal symptoms. The tech moved like his spine had suddenly remembered it had a purpose. Within 90 seconds, the man was lying on a stretcher, his arm extended, the fall line running clear. The medication was pushing into his bloodstream, the lorazepam first, quieting the electrical chaos in his nervous system, his breathing beginning to slow, his face beginning to soften. His last conscious act was to reach out and grab her wrist. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for," and then the medication took him under, his hand falling away, his body sinking into the mercy of sleep. Security arrived to an empty threat. But Hargrove was already on his phone. The incident report was filed by 3:30 a.m. Natalie could see the timestamp when HR printed it at her termination meeting. According to the documentation, she had violated hospital protocol by engaging directly with an armed assailant instead of waiting for law enforcement, thereby endangering 43 patients and staff members, operating outside the scope of nursing practice, and demonstrating a pattern of reckless judgment that had escalated across her tenure at Sacred Heart. The language was clinical, precise, the kind of weaponized bureaucracy that required no actual malice because the malice was simply implied in the structure of the sentences themselves. By 4:15 a.m., Hargrove had made his calls. Board member Patricia Chen answered despite the hour. She owed him 3 orthopedic referrals worth roughly $80,000 in billing codes. Board member Michael Sterling took the call at his country club, hungover but pliable. Board member Richard Voss was already awake, already familiar with the pattern. Hargrove's voice on those calls was calm, conversational, a concerned colleague describing a genuine safety issue, a nurse who had gone rogue, a liability that needed addressing before the hospital faced lawsuits. By 6 a.m., Hargrove had called the Colorado Springs clinic listed on Natalie's references, a place she had never actually worked, a place that existed primarily as a placeholder for reasons he would never need to understand. "Just some routine verification," he said to the voice that answered. "Your employee Natalie Hayes, was she ever involved in any incidents? Any disciplinary action? Anything concerning?" The voice on the other end was confused, then helpful, then invested in providing the right answer to give this doctor his satisfaction. By 7:30 a.m., the outside risk management consultant, brought in at Hargrove's request and funded by hospital discretionary spending, had compiled 47 pages of documentation. The consultant's name was David Pritchard, and he had built his entire career on the principle that aggressive retention of institutional liability was a revenue stream if you knew the right people to call. His report concluded that Natalie Hayes represented an unacceptable risk profile, that her actions violated multiple protocols, that her judgment had been catastrophically compromised, and that termination was the only prudent path forward. At 9 a.m., Natalie was called to the HR office on the 4th floor. The room had beige walls and a laminate table and 3 chairs arranged in the geometry of institutional power. Gerald Murphy, the HR director, looked like he had spent the last 24 hours convincing himself he was not complicit in what was about to happen. Across from him sat Patricia Chen, whose orthopedic referrals Hargrove had carefully catalogued, and beside her, David Pritchard with his 47 pages and his expensive pen and his complete absence of curiosity about whether any of it was actually true. "Natalie," Murphy began, and that word alone, her name, no title, no dignity, told her everything she needed to know about what was coming. "We've completed our investigation into the incident last night. We've also engaged an external consultant to provide an objective perspective." She sat very still. Her hands were folded on the table. She did not ask for union representation or call a lawyer or negotiate or fight. Instead, she simply sat with the understanding that to defend herself here would require revealing exactly why she had been able to walk toward a man with a loaded weapon without the fear response that would have paralyzed an ordinary person. It would require explaining the training, the tours, the decades spent learning how to move through violence without becoming violence, and if she explained that, then the hospital would know, then Hargrove would know, then her sister would eventually find out, and the anonymity she had wrapped around herself like a protective skin for 5 years, the invisible woman, the quiet nurse, the person no one had ever asked for more than her labor, would evaporate like rain on hot asphalt. Based on the documentation, Pritchard said, sliding the report across the table with the reverence of someone delivering a death sentence, your actions endangered 43 individuals and violated multiple safety protocols. You violated direct orders not to engage, Patricia Chen added, reading from a script someone else had written for her. The hospital has a zero-tolerance policy for reckless conduct. We're terminating your employment effective immediately, Murphy said. You'll receive 2 weeks of severance and COBRA information. Your final check will be direct deposited by Friday. Natalie nodded once. She stood. She walked to the door. On her way out, Pritchard called after her, "For what it's worth, you did save his life." She did not turn around. She did not respond. She simply walked through the corridors of Sacred Heart with her badge already being deactivated at the nursing station, her locker code already being reassigned, her presence already being erased from the institutional memory of the hospital in the same way a ship erases footprints in water. At 5 p.m. she packed a cardboard box. Inside it went a cracked coffee mug that said "Keep Calm" in faded letters, a gift from someone whose name she had stopped saying out loud. A dying succulent that had survived 3 months longer than anyone had predicted, a small victory against entropy. And a photograph, 4x6, curled slightly at the edges, Marcus Chen smiling 2 hours before the IED, his arm around her shoulders, both of them dusty and young and alive in a way that became impossible once you understood what loss actually meant. By 11 p.m. she was standing at a bus stop on Martin Luther King Boulevard, cardboard box balanced on her hip, rain hammering the pavement like applause for a performance no one had asked her to give. The bus arrived in 7 minutes. She got on. She sat at the back. She watched Sacred Heart disappear through the window into the Denver night, into the rain, into the distance where things go when no one fights to keep them. What she didn't know was that the man she had disarmed at 2:03 a.m. had been sitting in a federal facility for the last 6 hours, debrief continuing, his true identity being reassessed by people with clearances she would never qualify for. What she didn't know was that when DEA agent Tyler Ross regained full consciousness, the first thing he did was ask about the woman who had taken the .45 from his hands. What he told them when they asked how he knew her so perfectly, why he had maintained his cover even after recognition had flickered across his vision, was a single sentence, "Because I served with her fire team at FOB Shank. She saved my life twice in Helmand Province." And that single sentence, spoken at 6:13 a.m. in a federal facility, set in motion a series of telephone calls that would begin assembling at 5:56 a.m. the next morning, in the form of 3 black SUVs and a command vehicle pulling up to Sacred Heart's main entrance, with a Navy SEAL commander in dress blues walking past security like a man who had never encountered a rule he couldn't override with the weight of his presence alone. But that was still 8 hours away. For now, there was only rain. There was only distance. There was only a woman with nothing left to lose, which made her the most dangerous person anyone had ever underestimated. At 11 o'clock at night, rain hammered the parking lot like applause from a crowd that didn't exist. Natalie stood at the bus stop on Morrison Avenue, cardboard box balanced on her hip like a child she couldn't set down, couldn't afford to drop. Inside it, a cracked coffee mug with her mother's maiden name hand-painted on the ceramic, a dying succulent with leaves turning papery and thin, and a photograph, dog-eared and soft from 1,000 viewings, of Marcus Chen in desert camouflage, grinning like a man who believed he'd see tomorrow. He hadn't. The IED made sure of that. The convoy made sure of that. Her arms, holding him together as his blood pooled on the truck bed, made sure of that. The Greyhound bus pulled up at 11:07 p.m. Air brakes hissed like something dying slowly. Through the rain, she could see the driver checking his manifest, completely unaware that he was about to carry a woman with a Navy Cross and 2 silver stars to a new name, a new life, a place where no one knew that Senior Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes existed. That was the point. Anonymity was the only medicine left. She'd accepted the dismissal at 9:15 a.m. without a single word of protest. Dr. Hargrove had sat across the desk in that sterile administrator's office, mouth moving, words about patient safety concerns and protocol violations and the recommendation of our external risk consultant. Gerald Murphy, the hospital administrator, trembled like a man holding a live wire. Natalie had simply nodded. Took the folder. Left the badge on the desk. Let them believe they'd won. Because if she'd fought, if she'd appealed, if she'd asked for documentation, if she'd demanded to see their evidence, the investigation would spiral. The FBI would knock on doors. They'd subpoena files, dig into the background she'd buried so carefully, the classified service record she'd never mentioned to her sister, never put on applications, never let slip in tired moments at 3 a.m. They'd find the unit patch sewn into her jacket lining. They'd find the medals in the safe deposit box. They'd find the name on the top-secret FSCI clearance that hadn't been revoked yet, just dormant, like a sleeping thing waiting to wake. And she couldn't have that. Healing required invisibility. Justice wasn't worth the cost. The bus rolled north toward the mountains. Rain drummed the roof like fingers on a table. Natalie sat in the back, cardboard box on her lap, and pressed her forehead against the cold window. Outside, Denver's lights blurred into watercolor smears. By morning, she'd be in a different state. By the end of the week, a different name on a lease. By next month, different scrubs at a different hospital where no one would know she'd ever carried a rifle, ever performed a field cricothyrotomy on a bleeding Marine, ever held a man's organs in her hands to keep him alive for the medevac. Just a nurse. That's all anyone would see. That's all she needed them to see. The phone in her pocket vibrated at 6:07 a.m. She didn't recognize the number. She almost didn't answer. Senior Chief Hayes. A man's voice, clipped and military, a voice that didn't ask questions and didn't wait for permission. Commander James Reese, SEAL Team 3. I'm 3 minutes from Sacred Heart ER in Denver. I need you to listen very carefully. Natalie's grip tightened on the cardboard box. The coffee mug inside shifted, and she heard the faint clink of ceramic against ceramic. The man you disarmed last night. The one with the .45. He's DEA. Deep cover. He was working a cartel operation when a family member called him in a crisis, told him he needed pain medication for a gunshot wound that never happened. He was confused, desperate, weaponized. He walked into that emergency room at 2:03 a.m. planning to die. You talked him down in 7 minutes. You talked down a man trained by the federal government to resist interrogation. The DEA director was in the briefing. The FBI has questions. And we all know what you are, because we have the clearance to know, and I'm standing at the entrance of Sacred Heart right now with 2 federal agents and a lot of authority. The bus was pulling into a station 50 miles north of Denver. Natalie's hand was steady. Her voice was steady. I'm not in Denver anymore, sir. You are, Reese said. There was the sound of rotor blades in the background. A helicopter. We know exactly where you are. But you need to be at Sacred Heart in 40 minutes. There's a lot to correct. 3 black SUVs and a command vehicle rolled up to Sacred Heart's main entrance at 6:19 a.m., their grills catching the first light of morning like teeth. Commander James Reese stepped out in full dress blues, medals stacked across his chest like a silent argument against every lie anyone had ever told about what heroes looked like. Security tried to stop him. He walked past them without breaking stride, the kind of walking that didn't acknowledge resistance, and found Gerald Murphy in the administrative hallway. I need Senior Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes, Reese said. Her real personnel file. Murphy's face went the color of a man who understood, suddenly and completely, that he was about to lose something. His hands trembled as he pulled the file, the one with 3 months of employment, the sparse references from a Colorado Springs clinic that would turn out to be fake, the performance reviews written with studied blandness. His mouth opened and closed like a fish removed from water. "She's..." Murphy started. "She's a decorated officer of the United States Navy," Reese interrupted. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Authority has a pitch that doesn't require volume. She holds the Navy Cross. 2 silver stars. The Defense Superior Service Medal. She served 3 tours in Helmand Province. She personally saved 47 lives under fire. 47. Some of them are in this hospital right now, and every single one of them would have bled out under the care of the person she was training. The FBI agent spread documents across the administrator's conference table like a hand being played. Papers and printouts and server logs, the whole ugly architecture of Dr. Hargrove's scheme mapped out in Natalie's handwriting. Time-stamped, catalogued, precise. She documented everything. Every discrepancy, every inflated charge, every surgical procedure that didn't match the billing records. She'd done it automatically. The same meticulous attention to detail that kept people alive under fire in Helmand Province now kept institutional fraud visible to federal investigators. Agent Morrison held up a sheet of server logs, her eyes moving across them like a prosecutor reading guilty verdicts. Dr. Hargrove attempted to alter Natalie Hayes' personnel file at 11:16 p.m. last night. Forged disciplinary reports, backdated complaints dated to July that were created in the past 4 hours, fabricated patient safety incidents. Federal healthcare fraud carries up to 10 years incarceration. She paused. Set the page down like it was evidence at a crime scene. He panicked. When you served him notice of termination, he thought if he could just disappear her, the documentation would disappear too. Hargrove was in his office down the hall, packing personal items into a cardboard box, not unlike the one Natalie had carried to the bus stop at 11 o'clock last night. Security was already blocking the exits. He tried to run an hour earlier, realized there was nowhere to run from, and sat back down at his desk to accept what was coming. Reese found him there, and the commander simply stood in the doorway, arms crossed, and watched. He didn't say anything. Didn't need to. Authority has a gravity that pulls everything towards stillness and silence. "This is a misunderstanding," Hargrove said. His voice was thin, papery, the sound of a man whose confidence had evaporated like water under a lamp. "I was protecting the hospital from..." "You were embezzling," Agent Morrison said. She'd followed Reese into the office. "You worked with Nexus Medical Supply to inflate prices on chest tubes, arterial lines, and pericardiocentesis kits. You split the overcharges. Between 2021 and this month, you generated approximately $847,000 in fraudulent billing." Senior Chief Hayes' charting documented every discrepancy. Every single one. She claimed You billed Medicare for a 4-hour pericardiocentesis for cardiac tamponade for a patient named David Chen. Senior Chief Hayes' notes prove the procedure took 40 minutes. You claimed she contaminated the sterile field. We have video. You created an entire false narrative to terminate the one person whose documentation threatened your scheme. And when you realized she wasn't going to fight back, you panicked and forged her personnel file to make the termination stick. The board members Hargrove had called, the ones who owed him referrals, were already on speakerphone in the administrator's office, their lawyers telling them to cooperate fully with federal investigators. Patricia Doyle, the risk consultant, had produced emails from Hargrove explicitly directing her to find anything to justify termination of Hayes before month-end. Every strategic move, every competent manipulation, every brilliant calculation had left a trail of documents that Natalie's hands that had held Marcus Chen together as he died, hands that had performed emergency surgery on 6 wounded Marines in 18 minutes, had documented with meticulous precision. Security arrived at 8:15 a.m. Not hospital security, not people trained to wheel out drunk patients or manage violent visitors. Federal agents with badges and zero mercy and the kind of authority that doesn't negotiate. They walked Dr. Marcus Hargrove out of Sacred Heart ER in handcuffs, his wrists linked with steel, his face the color of a man watching his entire life compress into a small, dark space. They walked past the nursing station where he'd thrown charts at Natalie's feet. They walked past the cafeteria where he'd loudly bet 2 residents she'd quit within a week. They walked past the locker room where she'd changed into scrubs that hid scars no one else in that hospital would understand for another 18 hours. Every staff member stopped what they were doing. The monitors went quiet. The machines that beep and hiss and breathe for patients halted in their mechanical rhythms, and all of them watched. David Chen, the Army Ranger patient, was standing in a hospital gown by the nursing station, tube still hanging from his arms, and he came to attention. Raised his right hand to his temple and held it there, a salute, crisp and clean and full of recognition, as Hargrove passed. The kind of salute you give to a warrior, to someone who walked toward danger instead of away from it. Commander Reese found Natalie in the hospital cafeteria, sitting alone with a cup of black coffee, her eyes fixed on something no one else could see. He sat down across from her without asking, his dress blues crisp enough to cut, his medals catching the fluorescent light overhead like small accusations against a world that underestimated women. "The DEA wants to know if you'd consider a consulting contract," he said. 3 days a month. Teach their medical teams. Teach them how to triage under fire. Teach them what you know. He paused. "But the offer I came to deliver is better. The Navy is building a combat medic training facility at Coronado. Best instructors in the world. Leading instructor. 24 months. After that, you choose. Medical command, classified operations, or out. Your service record is no longer classified as requiring distance or denial. You're a senior chief petty officer of the United States Navy. You earned it. Some of us have known it all along." Natalie took a sip of coffee. Tasted copper and heat and the kind of certainty that comes from knowing you've just been seen, truly seen, by someone with the authority to understand. "When do I start?" she said. "Is that a yes?" "That's a when." Reese smiled. It was a small thing, but it was real. "Welcome back. If you've been underestimated by someone who didn't know your full story, hit like and subscribe. Comment below, what would you have done in Natalie's position? Accept dismissal or fight back? The answer says something about who you are when no one's watching.